Awesome. Thank you so much. Welcome everybody. Before I jump in with an introduction for those of you who don't know me, we're going to start with some writings. Let me share my screen here. Can everybody see that? Fantastic. So we're going to do what's called writing for full presence for about 3 minutes. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do is write about where you are mentally, emotionally, physically, right now. What's on your mind that might be keeping you from focusing for the next, 40, 15, 8 minutes of what we're going to be talking about. And try to really write continuously for those 3 minutes without letting your pen or pencil leave the page or your fingers leave the keyboard. Try to just write and just see where it goes. This importantly, you're going to be asked to share the kinds of things that you write about, not the actual writing that you do. So you can there'll be a little bit of separation. So for example, having just come from the previous session, I'm absolutely going to be writing on my fourth year dossier, which is due pretty soon because that's on my mind. So take a few minutes, and then I'll call everybody back. Okay, go ahead and wrap up whatever thought you're on. Cross your I's, dot your T's, and we'll come back together. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Ben Villarreal. I'm an assistant professor of English here at NMHU. I'm also a Highlands alum. I did my master's degree here years ago. And my area of expertise is the teaching of English, a little bit different than the teaching of writing, but the teaching of English specifically. And okay, and wanting to talk a little bit about how we can use writing that students kind of decide for themselves what it should look like is important, how it can be helpful, in a couple of different ways of going about it. And one of the first ways is what we just did, writing for full presence. And so what I would love to hear or read from you, you can either just unmute yourself and shout it out, or you can type it in chat. But thinking back on what you just wrote, what did it feel like to be given an open space to write? What did it feel like to be given that open space to just kind of blah on the page, whether that was digital or physical? And then we'll follow up with whether or not you enjoyed it and why or why not. So some thoughts. Let's see if I can open up chat. Therapeutic. I'm so glad, Beatrice. That's fantastic.
Ben, you gave me an opportunity. I just bought a new notebook, so this is actually my first journal entry. So it was a really good prompt. So thank you for that.
Fantastic. Other thoughts?
At first, I thought 3 minutes seemed a little bit long, but then I have a lot to write, so it was short.
Yeah, even as we were doing it, I was like, oh, maybe I did 3 minutes too long, and then I looked at the stopwatch that I have below me, and I was like, oh, it's over, we're done.
Yes, it helped me to. Oh, sorry. It helped me to put. This is Maria Haas. I'm not going to open up my screen, but I mean my camera. But sorry. And so it helped me to put down on paper what I have been thinking of all along this whole last semester, as far as a challenge with having to, deal with so much with COVID and having to help students in completing the requirements for their classes, especially field-based 1 and 2, which I was assigned to last semester. And school districts being closed and going virtual, and my students like stressing out. And so trying to help them. So it helped me to put that down on paper, and that I'm going to be doing field-based 2 again this semester. So yeah, it helped me to do that. So thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I see Luke and Benjamin put very similar responses in chat, reflect on the current state of mind, which is very much panicked. I'm absolutely feeling that. And felt like gathering loose marbles scattered on the floor. What a fantastic simile there, Benjamin. So yeah, I think this is a really, really great activity. And for all of you who are feeling that kind of panic, I would venture to guess, I will not speak for them, that our students feel exactly the same. And the first time I experienced this activity was with a mentoring teacher who began classes with this, and this is very much how I use it. Maybe not every class, but at least once a week, starting a class with just, hey, take 3 minutes to gather your thoughts before we jump into today's material. And it was, I found it really, really helpful, because I often would come rushing into class, my brain all over the place with whatever other things are going on, and to just have a moment to just kind of like catalog it is also, I agree, is very therapeutic. To just be like, okay, these are the things I'm thinking about. Oftentimes, not always, writing those things out can make them seem less big than they really are. And so that can be really, really helpful. But some of the effects of this and why I find it really useful. First off, this is really, really low stakes writing. And when I say low stakes, I mean low stakes for the students who are doing it, right? Because if you're very upfront with them about it, they're not going to be sharing it. They're not going to be, in that same sense, evaluated more than maybe you're just like, yeah, you did it, good job. And so it means that they can write about whatever they want. It's very much a kind of isolated writing that they don't need to worry about where it's going, but they're still doing that writing. It also gives them some agency, because it allows them to take some time from the class and decide what they want to do with it. Sometimes students will write a whole lot. Sometimes I've had students who will instead doodle. I'm usually okay with that too. Sometimes I'll have students who very visibly are just writing, I do not want to do this, I do not want to do this, I do not want to do this, over and over and over again. I'm fine with that also. That's perfectly fine, because they're taking that time and they're deciding what they do with it. Right? And that's really what we want to talk about today, is how we use writing that students determine the parameters of in order to have varying levels of stakes with the writing they do, but also varying levels of agency that we are sharing with them in the classroom. So let's think a little bit more generally about why student-determined writing is really, really important. And student-determined writing, as far as I can tell, is not like an established term. It's just kind of what I'm using to describe the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today. First off, especially in the instance of what we just did, is a mindfulness exercise. It's taking time to say, okay, we're just going to do this writing. We're going to put it in this moment, and we're going to just check in with ourselves, see how we're doing, before we decide that, okay, now we're going to talk about the material, or now we're going to jump into today's lecture, today's activities. And that kind of can help to kind of compartmentalize those things, because it's mindfulness on two ends, right? It's mindfulness of in the moment doing the writing, and then it's mindfulness on the other side of, okay, now I'm in the class because I've hopefully been able to focus a little bit more about what we're doing today. The other thing that's really, really important about student-determined writing is that it often, not always, and it doesn't have to, can decouple writing from assessment. As soon as students know that they're being assessed on writing, that writing changes, right? It's very different from writing that they might do for themselves if they do writing for themselves, right? But as soon as we're giving them ownership over it, it's pulling that away, because to what degree can I assess them on writing that they've decided how they want to do? And we'll talk a little bit about how we can still do that, but it pulls that away. It makes it so where I'm not writing for a grade, I'm writing because I'm interested in this, because this is a thing I want to write about. This is the way I want to write. And so it pulls that writing away from assessment just a little bit. Like we said, it also creates space for the agency over writing, because they get to decide what that writing looks like. And it shuts down what researchers Flower and Hayes called the monitor. Now, Flower and Hayes are really, really cool researchers who in the 80s came up with a cognitive theory of what they think the writing process looks like. And within that, they dubbed a part of the writing process that's called the monitor. And the monitor is the part of your brain that when you're writing, whether it's a paragraph or just a sentence, that tells your brain, wait, I need to reread that to make sure it makes sense. And then you spend the next 2, 5, 10, 30 minutes obsessing over that one sentence or that one paragraph. That's the monitor, right? And sometimes that is really, really helpful when it comes to editing, but it's very unhelpful when it comes to drafting, right? To putting together a first draft. It's very unhelpful to have that thing. And one of the ways that we learn to turn that off is by doing writing that doesn't need to be monitored. And so again, I'm going back to assessment. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple of other forms of student-determined writing beyond writing for full presence. The next one we're going to talk about is what are called commentaries. And commentaries are a place for preparing for a discussion about a class text. And one thing that's important is that I use text very broadly in my teaching. So a text can be anything from a tweet to a film, to a podcast, to a song, to a novel, to an article. I use text very broadly here. So having them prepare for discussion of a text, as well as keeping track of ideas that they might want to use and develop and write about later on. So commentaries, and I'm pulling from a really great writing instructor named Sheridan Blau, who's a professor of mine, who talked about this, and I'll share some of these references and resources at the end. And here we're taking the stakes of the writing and we're pushing them up just a little bit, but we're also increasing the agency a little bit. And so I'm going to walk through the protocol of what this looks like, talk about the effects, and then we're going to do a version of this together. So first off, when I'm presenting commentaries to students, I start with a very basic definition of they're making a contribution to a discussion of a literary work. And again, even literary work I use pretty broadly as going in there as well. Ask them to begin with I wonder, and then once they've exhausted that thought train, continuing with which makes me think. I don't generally require or give a ton of time. Usually around 7 minutes for this is pretty good. 7 minutes for an article that we might have just read or a text we might have just looked like that might just have taken 5-10 minutes of class time to look at together, maybe a little bit longer depending on the level of students that you're working with, and kind of just letting them exhaust those thoughts. Then in small groups, they come together and they read their commentaries aloud to one another while taking note of what their commentaries do, not what their commentaries are about. So for example, a lot of students, especially a lot of, when I do this in freshman composition classes, go to summary. They go to that book report mode, right? And so they write up a summary. So that might be one of the things their commentary does. Some might go a little bit further and start and pull specific quotes and analyze them. Some might start writing about something and be like, oh man, that reminds me of this time. And then they tell a personal story. That's what their commentary does, right? Not what it's about. And then each group reports back to class about the things their commentaries do. We catalog those, and then those become the features of our commentaries for this one class for the rest of the semester. And then that's what we expect from commentaries. Maybe not every single thing. And as the teacher, I might put my thumb on the scale just a little bit and be like, yeah, quoting sounds really, really important. Let's really try to push that. And let's make sure we always quote. Maybe you don't have to include a personal story, but let's try to always quote. And I might push that just a little bit based on the things that I do want to see that they're learning about. So some of the effects of this: one, it immediately situates writing within a larger discussion because you're asking them to make a contribution, right? You're putting them in the place to continue a discussion that's already going, which is a place that a lot of students don't start from when they think about writing in response to a reading, or if you're giving them sort of the typical reading response summary, what do you think about this? They're still positioning their thoughts in relation to the text as opposed to a continuation of something that's already going on. That seems like a small thing, but over time, it really does make a difference in the way that students start to view what it is that they're writing. Because again, they're not just writing a response to something and then that's it. They're continuing something that already existed, and in doing so, they kind of make it their own. They find their own place in that as well. It encourages curiosity over regurgitation. The I wonder, which makes me think, phrases them as putting a prime importance on their own thoughts, not on showing you that they know what it is that they read. Right? And again, we're not asking them to regurgitate something. We're asking them to just develop their own thoughts and see where it goes. And that's really, really important because again, that creates more ownership of what it is that they're learning, as opposed to, okay, this is what he wanted me to get from this article, so let me summarize it and give it back to him, and then he'll know that I know it. I'm not interested in that in most of my classes, but to see where those thoughts develop is much more important and much more helpful in other writing later on in the future, because then that curiosity becomes a seed for something else. Genre analysis. This is a really, really great way of getting students to think about what a text does, right? One of the best ways to get students to write a literature review or a systematic review, or to get them to write a research proposal, or to get them to write an editorial, is by looking at those genres and saying, okay, not what is it about, what does it do? And this becomes a great assignment. I usually do this introductory commentary assignment really early in the semester. It becomes a great way, a great reference point to keep going back and being like, okay, like remember when we talked about commentaries and what they do? Okay, now what is this text doing? And really separating how it's working from what it's saying can be really, really helpful from students. And it's important for them to learn that as a modeling exercise as well. And last, again, it's agency over the writing because it's privileging how they chose to respond, right? They didn't respond wrong. They determined how they were going to respond, and now we're going to use that. And that's really powerful signaling to students because it shows that you think that the way that they think is important. There's not a right or wrong way for them to think and respond to everything. You might still want them to respond in a very specific way in other assignments that you give in the class, but here, where we're starting a discussion of a topic or of a text, you're kind of saying there's not a wrong way. Whatever way seemed like the most prescient way of responding, that should be how you respond going forward, or that should be some of the ways that you respond going forward. This can sometimes mean that students respond in really, really interesting and off-the-wall ways. As I mentioned before, I always have students who doodle. I always have at least one student who, at a certain point, gets done with their commentary and doodles, and then when I find out about it, I'm like, doodling images are absolutely part of our commentaries now. As time progresses, that usually turns to including memes and GIFs and things like that in their commentaries, which I'm fine with as well. And so part of this, and we're gonna keep discussing this, is also about you in letting students determine what it is and how they write. Also means you're giving up a little bit of control, which can feel uncomfortable and it can feel like not familiar. But especially in just some of these small ways, and I wouldn't suggest you like completely go, all the way and just be like, yeah, just do whatever you want, but kind of building up and seeing like where your comfort level is, and then also adapting with students is sort of a mutual development as well. We'll talk about giving up more control in a minute, but I want us to take a moment to talk about this and to think about this a little bit more. And so we're going to kind of do this activity. We're going to look at your writing for full presence. I'm gonna ask Veronica to put you all into breakout rooms in a minute. And we're going to skip the read aloud because, like I said, I'm not asking you to share your writing for full presence, and I wouldn't ask students, but we're going to pretend that that was your commentary. And you're going to just discuss what your writing for full presence, or in this case, commentaries, did. Right? And so, for example, like I said before, and this is exactly what I wrote about. I wrote about a little checklist of the other things I need to put into my fourth year dossier based on the last session. And maybe you have something similar, or maybe you have a grocery list, or maybe you're thinking about lunch, and so you wrote about lunch. What are the things that your writing for full presence did? Not what it was about. It could also just be what you shared. It was a place to gather my thoughts. That's it. That's all you have to say with your small groups. But keep a tally of what these commentaries are doing, and then you're going to report back in a moment. All right? Questions about that? Quibbles? Controversies? Veronica, can you place us into breakout rooms of 3 or 4 people for like 3 minutes?
Sure, I'm on it.
Thank you. I'm going to stop share while we do this.
In 2021 is looking pretty good.
Oh my goodness. Cover of all the magazines right here.
Right.
Well, thank you all. I hopefully you got to wrap up your conversations. I know we probably could have kept talking for a little while, so I apologize if not everyone got to share out about the kinds of things. But what I would love to do is just kind of hear what some of those kinds of writing that you did. Again, we're not so much what you wrote about, but the kinds of things. And so I'm going to start us off, and I'm just going to start a little tally from my group. We wrote about what we're thinking about, like what's on our mind right now. That's sort of like right at the front, because it makes sense to write about that. It's at the front of our mind. The news came up, writing about the news. Let's see, to-do list. Yeah, and those were kind of those are the overarching categories that I heard from my group. Does anybody else want to share 1 or 2 things from their groups, the kinds of writing you did?
I can if nobody else would like to.
Thank you, Amanda.
Not a problem. So for my group, we talked about how doing that writing inspired us to do a certain form of work. Leon was mentioning it inspired him to set up his Brightspace page. We talked a little bit about how this kind of writing was a space for us to process. I compared it to a kind of written yoga because I've been doing some yoga, and it's, a full body like check-in, but instead of through your breathing and through stretching, it's through the act of writing. And then we also mentioned how that writing drew attention to questions that we had about certain areas of our teaching or our work that we needed to have addressed. So it was a kind of cataloging.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Let's hear from another group.
I was gonna say that kind of along those lines with the yoga, that it felt definitely like a body scan, like emotional scan to just kind of see what is there, and then a sense of like organizing it, or again like cataloging. And I don't know, I think that we all sort of realized just how much stuff was present within our mental spaces, and to kind of think about that's all that stuff is there, so like we're not able to absorb other stuff, if that's there, so kind of letting go, like a process of letting go of all those things to make space.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Is there maybe one more group?
For our group, there was consensus about the concerns over the COVID impact for our students, and also having to go fully online. So the challenges it has created for many students who aren't used to this type of modality. Another area we talked about was that this activity helped us in thinking about being organized if we have a tendency to procrastinate. And then also a theme that came forth was in this being a great activity and helping us to really focus on caring for ourselves. So an awareness of the self-care.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm sure we could keep adding to this list. I want to just push us forward just a little bit and kind of look at this from a meta perspective. And so if we were doing this as a commentary, and these were the kinds of writing you did in your commentary, these would be the kinds of features we would expect to see, would be okay to see, that we would want to place prime importance on in our commentaries for the rest of the semester. And again, it is hopefully it challenges you to think in a little different way when you're thinking about how you wrote as opposed to what you wrote. And that again can be that in itself is a really great check-in for students to have regularly as well, because oftentimes, as we said before, writing is so assigned in our minds to assessment or for this very specific person or a very specific purpose when we're in school, that it can be really hard to separate those two things. And this gets us into thinking about those as separate things, what we write about from how we write. Carol had a really great question about how we would do this in a fully online class. I would do it basically just, I have done it exactly just like what we did, is we would read a text. Like I said, usually it's something short. If we're doing it in class together, I might have them do some of that reading ahead of time. And then we would do just like we did. I would give them the I wonder, which makes me think prompts. I would place a heads up, a reminder that this is a contribution to a discussion of the text, give them a few minutes to do the writing on their own, put them in small breakout rooms to share what they wrote with one another while cataloging the things that they have done, and then come back to the main Zoom and just like you all did, share those things, put together our list, and then this list, it would go on our class website. Every time there's a commentary, I repost these features, be like, and remember, these are the features. Sometimes I add to them, like I said, or sometimes I place extra importance on certain ones. Oftentimes for freshman composition, I do ask students to include a short summary. I might put in a word count for some classes. It kind of depends, and that can kind of change with those things as well. So, for asynchronous, that's a really great question. I haven't had to do that, but I think I would do it somewhat similarly. What I would have them do instead, obviously they wouldn't read out loud to one another. I would have them kind of read maybe one or two other students to themselves while taking note of those things that they see those commentaries doing, and have them add to maybe a shared document of, these are the things I noticed, the commentaries I read doing from that first post, or from a discussion board, or from a thread, however you might do it in that sense. And then still do it, you would give them that time and say, okay, everybody has to submit their, well, I usually call them practice commentaries the first time. Everybody has so much time to submit their practice commentaries, and everyone has so much time to read, respond, and then share back what the features are. But I think it would work. That's a good question. I haven't thought about that, because I don't teach too much asynchronously. But yes, I would imagine discussion board would work really well. So let me, oops. Okay, great. Let me stop that share and make a new share. Okay, and let's jump to the next thing. So that's commentaries. And let's talk a little bit about invitations to create. And so now here we are, of the three things that I'm going to talk about today, here we're sort of giving up the most control. The stakes for the students are going to be the highest, but the agency that we're sharing with the students is also going to be the highest, like I said, of the three strategies I'm talking about today. So invitations to create are kind of, they're invitations. They're meant to speak to the recipients and kind of get those creative juices flowing and respond in a way that will hopefully lead to engaging conversations or more meaningful interactions interactions with the class. And so this one we will not do a example of together, although I will again share some of those resources. But let's jump into what this looks like. So as I said before, here this is the highest stakes for students, but also the highest chances for agency. So first off, you're basically writing a prompt to respond, right? You're writing an invitation that your students can then use to create something, all right? Usually it begins with a quote from whatever text that we're currently reading, as well as the context of it. So we might say in chapter 3, the author says this in response to this. Pretty straightforward. We follow that up from another quote, either from the text, from somewhere else in the text, or from a related text, again with the context of that quote. However, so-and-so says this when they're writing about this in response to whatever, right? Where the context is really, really important, not just the quote itself, but the context. The quote's important because it gives a specific point in the text for students to look at. The context is important because it gets them to start thinking outside of that specific quote and what those other related ideas might be. Then we offer an outside, and I hate this term, but I couldn't think of a better way of putting it, a real world source. So something from outside the class. This might be another quote from an article or something in the news or another book that you're going to ask them to look at later. It might be a video clip, an audio clip. It might be a whole article. You might give them a whole other article to look at. But we want to pull in some other source that's related to what we're talking about from outside the class. Right? We give them those three things, and then we ask them to consider all three, the two quotes and the outside source, side by side, and respond in whatever way seems best to you. And then we give them lots of different ways that they might respond. Poetry, prose, music, art, video, dance. However they might decide to respond and share back with the class, we create that space for them to decide how they do that. Yeah, let's talk about what the effects are before we come back. So first off, you're including specific parts of multiple texts, which creates, or multiple parts of the same text, which creates multiple entry points, right? As soon as you're giving students more than one thing to latch onto, you're giving them more than one possible thing. They might not have anything to say about two of those things, but one of them, hopefully within three, they can latch onto an idea that they can, okay, I can do something with that. And maybe in the best case scenario, they can talk about all three with ease, right? But you're giving them three possible access points to discuss whatever it is you're asking them to discuss or learn about. One of the things I really love about invitations to create is that even students who haven't done the reading can usually participate. Even students who, especially when you bring in that outside source, even if students haven't read the chapter or the book or the article that you're asking to read, oftentimes, especially if you take something that's from current events or contemporary pop culture, students can respond. Students can find an entry point. So on the flip side of that, if they haven't read, it gives them a reason to go back and look at the text because they realize that before they've even read it, they have something to say about it. Right? And that can be a really, really helpful way of pulling them in if they're behind on the reading, if they just haven't gotten it yet, or they don't see the purpose of it before that point. You're creating a greater sense of their ownership over the concepts because you're saying these are the concepts, these are the texts, and then you're letting them do whatever they want with it, right? And so they have hopefully greater understanding, but greater engagement because it's up to them to decide what they want to do with those ideas, right? You're not saying, here's the ideas, now write me an essay. You might also do that, but in this instance, you're giving them that freedom to kind of just decide what they want to do with it, maybe as a starting point that can then turn into that essay or that report or whatever it is you want them to write. And last, you're creating space for different genres of composition that allows students to kind of determine the best way to express or to demonstrate their learning, right? One of the things that I find is really, really interesting from this is just how students choose to respond. I'm going to shout out / call out Sarah Lupita Oliveras because last semester I gave lots of invitations to create. I had lots of students who were turning in poetry, and I was just like, wow, we just have a lot of poets. And then later found out that they were all in Sarah's poetry class. But I thought that was really cool because what they were enjoying and learning from her class, they were immediately putting it and applying it to my class. They were using it to make sense of the things that we were discussing. And one, that's just great, cross-class collaboration without meaning to. But again, it's giving them a way to decide how they want to respond. I had lots of students who wanted to respond with poetry. Let's see, I got something in. Yeah, it was great. I've never read so much poetry in one class before as in one of my classes last semester. I'm gonna pause here. Questions about invitations to create, and again, I will provide some resources and things as we move forward. But questions about the protocol, the effects. If this feels uncomfortable, that's okay. It can. I've gotten off the wall stuff in response to these.
Ben, I do have a question here. I love this. This is really great. And I really have been trying to find ways to cultivate creativity with my students. So how would you go, how would you approach a student, for example, if they feel like they don't have the ability to be creative, or they say, well, I just don't really know what to produce. I'm not a creative type of person. How would you go about inspiring a student to kind of find that creative platform so they can be creating these amazing poems or generating these really interesting memes, so they can feel like empowered and they can develop that sense of creative flow?
Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah. So one of the things that's really, really important about invitations to create is that they are invitations. And the way that they're structured in my class is that means students can refuse them. They can choose not to accept that invitation. It doesn't mean you have to do it that way. You don't have to call them this. I think in the class that Veronica's teaching this semester, they're not invitations. They are a thing that she's asking students to do. And you can totally do that, and that's fine. But again, what that means is that you also are giving space for students, because you're giving space for students to respond in the way that they want. I mean, I have lots of students who still write me essays, academic prose in response to these. And that's fine, because for some students, that's the primary way in which they feel most comfortable and the way that they feel they can best demonstrate their ideas and thoughts about a topic. And that's fine. That said, oftentimes it's great if there's a way of showcasing what students create in response to these invitations. Because what that does is then that starts to raise the bar a little bit, because students will start to see, like, one, they'll look at something and be like, I could do that for this assignment. And then that gives them something else that they can do too. They can be like, okay, that was pretty cool. I think I can do something like that or something better. And so what often happens is in the course of that sharing, what gets shared just kind of like keeps elevating in terms of, not in terms of quality, but in terms of the risk that students are willing to take with their creativity. And so, yeah, I've had, especially early in the semester, a lot of students choose to just respond in prose or in academic prose, or in students who write me essays when they turn in invitations to create. But over time, often it does start to get loose. And I think one student shared a poem last semester, and then a bunch of the other students who were also in Sarah's class were like, oh, we can do that. Oh, I've been writing poetry all semester. And then they're just willing to throw that in there and put it together and write. It was methods of teaching and tutoring English. So I got lots of poems about teaching and tutoring English last semester. Yeah, and again, you're giving them that sort of place to decide how they want to respond. Does that answer your question, Leon?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Ben.
Great, I'm glad. Other questions, other thoughts, other concerns? Okay, so there was something else I wanted to say here. I don't remember what it was. I will say that doing these kinds of prompts and these kinds of writing are not going to make a difference for your students right away. Especially, this is purely anecdotal, observational. I find that graduate students especially struggle with these kinds of writing over freshmen, because the longer you're in school, maybe the longer you're used to a specific, that's what I'm reasoning, the longer you're used to a specific kind of response or a specific kind of writing, or getting very specific instructions on how you're supposed to write stuff. What that also means, though, is that I've noticed is that when students have been in classes with me for a couple of semesters, they're much more quick to be like, okay, yeah, we did commentaries last semester, I know how to do this. And they can kind of help bring the class along. But yeah, oftentimes students are, resistance, not the right word, I'm going to say unsure about this, because they're like, really? Like, I can just respond anyway, and they want to like test those waters a little bit. Or again, they may just not feel comfortable. They may just be like, you know what, I can't draw. I'm just going to write an essay because that's what I do. And again, that's fine as far as the way that I view it. But it is something that, again, you may not see an immediate embrace of this kind of work if you decide to do some of it. So moving forward, so what I would like you to do, I'm going to ask Veronica to again put us into breakout rooms. We're doing okay on time. Let's say for 4 minutes, Veronica, if you don't mind. And let's do different breakout rooms. Let's get to interact with some new folks. And I want you to discuss, just brainstorm. What are some ways that you might adapt these? Because there's no reason that you have to use them the way that I've talked about them in your class. What are some ways that you might incorporate some of this kind of student-determined writing in your own classrooms? And then we'll report back and hear what everybody has to say.
Are we good to go?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Hello, hello.
Back, everybody. Hopefully everyone.
You're
Thank you.
still muted.
Hopefully everyone had a chance to
Yeah.
chat about.
We got cut off at the last.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to be cognizant of the time because I'm sure everybody is ready for lunch. I know I am, and so I apologize if you got cut up. But what I'm going to do is I would like us to be able to continue this conversation as much and to the degree as you want after this session is over. And so what I'm going to do in just a moment is I'm going to share a doc. It's a shared doc that everyone can put. And I'm going to stop this share. And what it is a way for us to be thinking about in a couple of weeks, maybe if you try some of these things, what are some of the, oops, wrong tab. What are some of the strategies you might have tried, as well as some reflection on how they work. So there's a link to the doc, and if you don't want to open it up right now, I'm gonna share it on my screen. I have too many tabs open. And so what this is going to ask you to do is think about the experience of maybe if you try one or two of these strategies, or if you're just feeling like gung-ho and you want to try all three. Over the next couple of weeks, maybe come back to this and tell us what strategies you might have tried. What was the result? What did you notice? What are just some observations you made about utilizing that strategy in your class? What are some of the implications that you might take from that? Maybe you're like, you know what, students hated this because I think it was this, and so maybe I'll change it to this. And then thinking about how you might adjust that in more practical terms. So like we tried writing for full presence for 10 minutes and everybody was bored, so we're going to cut it down to 3. Like what are the practical things that you might do to adjust that strategy? And then what are the next steps that you might want from this? Would you like to, do we want a follow-up meeting in 2 weeks to talk about how these things met? Do you want to just try adapting what you're reading on this shared doc that other people are doing? What might you do with that? I lost that thought. What might you do that you've read that other people are doing, or how might you adapt it? And so this is optional. This is you know, as teachers, we don't ever just like give a lecture and then never talk about something again, right? We give students the opportunity to come back. And so I wanted to create that opportunity. If you want to continue these conversations, they can happen right here on this doc. And again, if this is something that we want to follow up on, I'm I'm more than happy to do so. Let me, yes, Beatrice, all of that will be shared. And what I'm going to do right now, though, is I'm going to, come on. Uh-oh. Okay, maybe I'm not because my computer has decided. There we go. I'm going to share with you some of the resources and references in chat as well as sharing them here. Come on. Oh, wow, my computer is deciding to really die. So here are the resources that I talked about. Let me see if I can bring up my PowerPoint again, as well as some hyperlinks to some things. Yeah, so this is what I just shared in chat. If you want to go look at some of these things, you'll notice I'm unabashedly linked back to my doctoral institution. And so you'll see a lot of things from there and from my professors as well, and colleagues who still are there. But yeah, are there any questions, quibbles, controversies before we run out of time for today?
Ben? I wanted just to kind of point out when in the creations for, or the invitations for Create, it's to create, not creativity, which was a really big hurdle for me, because it doesn't have to be something creative. It could be something as much as like even making bread or putting water in a glass, you know, those are creating of some things. So just kind of wanted to share that little nugget of my realization when it comes to those sort of invitations.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, yeah, that's a really, really good point. It's not necessarily an invitation to be creative, even though it's creative in the way that the student decides, right? So yeah. Well, thank you all so much. Hopefully this was helpful and interesting, and if nothing else, it was so great to see and talk with you all after how many weeks of not being on campus. So it's good to see everyone, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and a good start to the semester.
And before you leave, I just want to thank you. I just, out of all of the many colleagues that I have, every time I get a chance to sit in as attendant in what you lead, I always learn something new. So I really appreciate the dedication that you put in, and I aspire to be able to be as instructional as you are. So thank you so much for your hard work and dedication to our institution.
Thanks very much, Leon.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you for everyone for participating. We have our lunch break coming up, and then Ruth Mary Kompolsky will be delivering our compliance training. So be back for that if that is something. It's always important. Also, just an FYI, our Safe Zone training had to be canceled today, but we will be rescheduling that for a later time, and maybe we'll do like 2 different times so that we work with everyone's schedule. So be on the times in the future. Thank you so much. Have a good one.